So after sitting down and making the grave mistake of watching every first round playoff game, I decided to share my misery with you all by teaching you the lessons I learned while watching these games. Let's start with Indiana versus Notre Dame. For starters, it's that Notre Dame's defense is in fact the real deal. Indiana had been torching teams all year, and despite their alleged weaker schedule, Notre Dame's schedule was held under the same scrutiny. So we had an offense that was averaging 41 points per game, taking on a defense that only allowed 2 games where the opposing team scored over 14 points, and something had to give, and my god, it was Indiana's offense. Notre Dame's defense held incredibly strong, and don't let that 17 points fool you. 14 of those came in the last 90 seconds of this game, so the vast majority of the contest felt incredibly out of reach for the Hoosiers. I mean, 126 of those 278 offensive yards they had came also in the last 4 minutes of garbage time drives against a prevent defense and probably third and fourth stringers, so during the first 55 minutes of play, they had only 152 yards to show for it. That being said, Indiana's defense either looks solid or this Notre Dame offense is going to struggle down the stretch. Their ground game was held up by a single 98-yard run, where, bar that, they only had a little over 100 yards of rushing, with a big X factor going into the following weeks being their special teams as they go on to play Georgia, because as of right now, they put out a poor performance on special teams, only nullified by a mirrored poor performance from the other side of the ball. But kicking balls into the arms of defenders isn't winning football. 34 yards per punt isn't winning football, and they were a more penalized team with 2 false starts and a few encroachments. And if you're doing all of that with your home crowd, I can only imagine you're going to have a rough time going down to face Georgia. And all I can say about Indiana's lip dig performance on offense is that the theme for this video is you can really tell which teams have played meaningful postseason games in the last decade versus which teams that haven't, which brings us to SMU versus Penn State. And did I say the theme was teams playing meaningful big games in the last decade being a theme? The joke was typically that Penn State would choke away big games every chance they had to play them, but that being said, at least they've had chances to play big games, where SMU has clearly not. Their biggest game in the last decade was getting blown out by Cincinnati before they left for the Big 12, and coming into the ACC, they were blessed with a weaker schedule, as the one solid team they played in the regular season ended up being BYU, who they lost to. That 4th down conversion at the start of the game pretty much felt like it set the tone. The lights were simply too bright. They'd show flashes of competency that would be thrown away in interceptions, and of course, the Happy Valley effect, as they couldn't get it done if they got into the red zone thanks to false starts and the noise just being overwhelmed. Penn State, on the flip side, will not be able to coast by any further games on the offensive performance that they had. They couldn't get anything going on that side of the ball until they had a nice, fluffy 2-touchdown lead where they got to feast on a visibly demoralized opponent as they threw their 3rd interception of the day. That being said, stopping the run and forcing their opponent to throw the ball could turn out to be an excellent strategy next week, assuming their secondary can put up another big performance like this one while facing down the Ginty-led Broncos. But their specialists will need a better performance, as Broncos punter James Ferguson Reynolds feeds on cold air, and it appears that their kickers are forged out of ice, with a specialist coach on staff and former pro kicker Tyler Rausa to aid them through any turbulence if needed, while Penn State's punter looked like he was left out high and dry in the wind. Now, once again, we'll repeat a theme of this video. It's clear which teams have played under the lights before, because Clemson looked like the most respectable visiting team of the weekend by a long shot. They were poised, they fought hard, they were the best visiting team quarterback play by a country mile, but the ghost of their regular season losses came back to bite them. They couldn't stop the run, and I mean, Louisville ran for 210 on them, Georgia ran for 170, but Texas would run for 292. On top of that, they couldn't establish the ground game themselves, which was a theme for their Georgia and South Carolina losses, but even through all of that, they had 14 unanswered points at the end of the 3rd and the start of the 4th, only separated by a gutsy 4th down stand, and realistically, they were 1 touchdown away. Then they gave up a 77-yard touchdown run. After all of that, they were still attempting to score the next drive, but were held off, and overall, this was the only game where near the end of the 4th, you kind of felt like both teams were still in it, despite the 14-point deficit. Now, on Texas' side, holy shit, those boys can run. The ground game is a certified problem if they're firing like this. Quinn Ewers looked solid, although they didn't overly rely on him due to his injuries that he's been fighting, but my question all comes on the defensive side, because I don't think Cade Klubnik and the Clemson running back room was nearly the strongest that they're going to see this year, and they looked good against that Texas secondary, but luckily for them, they just have to stop the run next week. Not saying that it's going to be easy, they do have Cam Skabedo. But for the last game, it was the one that was supposed to be the closest of the weekend, the 8 seed taking on the 9 seed, Tennessee taking on Ohio State, where I can assure you it was not close at all. I think if you watched the Michigan game and then turned around and watched this one, you probably would get whiplashed. Will Howard and the Ohio State offense was absolutely electric. Some of the passes thrown and caught would leave you wondering how anybody is going to defend them, much less the third best team in the SEC, who is now getting outed as potentially the fifth best SEC team since Alabama and Ole Miss got to rack up some amazing hypothetical wins against Indiana and SMU. But on top of that, their defensive line is something that Tennessee's quarterback is going to be seeing in his nightmares like non-flashbacks for the next decade. And although he did a solid job scrambling, it just wasn't enough. But the combination of Jeremiah Smith and Egbuka clearly proved to be the #1 threat coming out of this weekend. And for whatever it's worth, Tennessee never gave them a super short field until a failed desperation 4th down conversion in the 4th quarter. And there wasn't a single part of the game where I felt like Tennessee had an advantage, except for the very slight edge in the punting game. And if anything, I feel bad for Oregon because this is a pretty shitty reward for being the #1 team and having to face a pissed off, I can't believe we just lost to Michigan again, and now we have something to prove Ohio State University team. And by the way, they only beat them by 1 the first time they met, so this is going to be a tough one next week. So with these individual lessons out of the way, you may wonder what the overarching themes of the weekend could possibly be. And first, I think something we can all agree on is that the 9 through 12 seeds need to be better evaluated. The real clickbait way to say this is that we should cut down to 8 teams or just let all the fighting for spot SEC teams in, but the reality is we just have to do a better, proper evaluation so that way the games like this shouldn't be so uncompetitive at the bottom. Now, people cited that these are the higher seeds playing the lower seeds, so we should expect a lack of competition, but not to this degree, because obviously the top 4 seeds are left out, so this is really like the mid seeds fighting the bottom seeds, and that's where I'd like to see it be a little bit closer, at least to like the Texas Clemson game levels. And the second thing I learned was that holy crap, home field advantage is a bitch. I mean, between the offsides calls, having to burn timeouts to get plays in, and just the size of the moment, you could tell that certain teams were currently facing the most hostile road environments that they have ever seen, and having huge moments to live up to. And speaking of the size of the moment, let's talk about the people who did not live up to this moment, and that was the special teams unit. I mean, we had some terrible looking missed field goals, muffed punts, bad punts, shank punts. We had it all. And part of it is I made a video where clearly they were using new footballs that played a role, as well as I think a lot of punters and kickers were playing in their first meaningful postseason game ever, and the atmosphere in those games is a lot different than a regular season one. Also, most schools don't have a specialist coach, which is something that I think needs to be changed because these guys have to be able to prepare better for moments like this, especially with the extreme inclement weather. And as for my thoughts for next week, who's going to win, I've got Georgia beating Notre Dame with the asterisk that they have to get at least somewhat acceptable quarterback play. Texas is probably getting the win over Arizona State, assuming they can stop Scatabo. But if they can't, Arizona State has a really good chance of pulling it off. I think a pissed off Ashton Jeanty is going to run through Penn State's line, forcing them to move some corners in, which will open up the pass game, which has been their strategy all year, and I think it pays off again. And I think that OSU is going to have an advantage coming out over Oregon because they're playing hot, they're pissed off, and I think they're going to be able to pull that one out. But let me know who you guys think is going to win in the comments below. What lessons did you learn from watching this weekend, and what should the NCAA do with the playoffs moving forward?
Criticizing him if they had gotten that championship. Didn't happen, of course.